which she studied at the University of London. She's published widely on the affairs of the Middle East, both in English and Arabic, with articles in The Guardian, The Independent, Huffington Post, among various other publications. She also directs the Arabic online multi-platform Meme magazine. Worth noting also, of course, that Sumaya is the daughter of Rashid Ghannouchi, the elected speaker of the dissolved Libyan. Sorry, I knew that would get me. Focus too much on Libya. Got that in the first few lines. Tunisian parliament. And finally, last but not least, Tariq Majorisi is a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at ECFR. His work mainly addresses how European policymaking towards the Maghreb and Mediterranean regions can become more strategic, harmonious, and inclusive. He's had a long-term focus on Libya, but also it focuses increasingly on Tunisia. His articles have featured in publications such as Foreign Policy Magazine and The Guardian, and he has contributed to think tank programming across the US, Europe, and the MENA region. So, with that very, very brief introduction, how this will work today is we're going to speak with each of our panelists and have them answer a couple of questions in rounds. We're going to do that for about the first 30 minutes or so, before then opening up to participants to ask questions to the panel. I should note that despite this being a Chatham House event, it is not taking place under the Chatham House rule. This is live and public and is being broadcast on Facebook as well as through the webinar function that you join us with. So without further ado then, let's dig into some of the detail of what's been happening in Tunisia. I think for many of us casual observers, there's been so much happening since the appointment in 2019 of Kais Saied, the discussion of what's happening on the legal front with the constitution, with the parliament, increasing clampdowns in that sector and the detention of various figures. Of course, as well, a lot of coverage is focused on the parlous state of the Tunisian economy, a massive rise in migration, and the political moves that are associated with that. So let's bring in our panel then. Saeed, welcome to this Chatham House webinar. I wonder if you could start us off by setting the scene. We've talked and heard a lot about what's happened in the legal space, and given your background and focus, we thought you'd be the perfect person to give us a rundown of the key developments in that area and kind of tell us a bit about the implications of what's happened to date.
Thanks, Tim. Definitely, I think when it comes to the legal frameworks that allowed President Kais Saied to consolidate authoritarianism in the country, there are three distinct legal frameworks. First one is the Constitution itself, the 2022 Constitution. You compare it to the 2014 Constitution, the major fundamental safeguards of the rule of law and human rights were removed from the 2022 Constitution. The guarantees related to neutrality and subordination of armed and security forces to civilian authorities were removed. The guarantees related to checks and balances and separation of power were removed. The parliament is not considered to be an equal branch of the state, but rather as a function. Parliament with no powers to approve the government, exercise any effective control over executive authority, or any kind of check over the president or the cabinets. The guarantees related to the judiciary were dismantled, were removed from the Constitution. I give concrete examples. 2014 Constitution provided for the office of the prosecutor to be independent. Such independence was removed from the 2022 Constitution. The 2014 Constitution provided for military court jurisdiction to be limited to military offenses. Those guarantees were removed from the 2022 Constitution. And the Constitution 2014 provided for institutional safeguards for judicial independence, that the Higher Judicial Council to be composed of majority of judges who are elected, and other institutional safeguards that were removed. And as a result, we still have the framework of the state of exception and the decrees that were adopted by the president who are still into force. So because of the dismantling of these guarantees and these checks and balances and these safeguards that can protect human rights and ensure that authorities are acting in compliance with the laws, etc. We reach the situation in which the justice system is being politicized. Judges, prosecutors, independent judges and prosecutors are prosecuted themselves, and opposition leaders and journalists. So the crackdown on the rule of law and human rights that is taking place in Tunisia right now find its roots in the first legal framework, the dismantling of the guarantees of the rule of law and checks and balances in the constitution. In addition to that first framework, there is another one related to the state of exception. July 2021, President declared state of exception, and with it, give himself the power to rule by decree. And we are living today the consequences of implementing those decrees that were adopted unilaterally and adopted by the president to crack down on human rights and the rule of law. When you hear that independent judges or independent prosecutors are suspended, that is based on Decree 35, that allowed the president to dismiss judges and prosecutors unilaterally without any safeguards, without any guarantees, without any process, just by decree. When you hear that bloggers, that journalists, that human rights defenders, opposition leaders are being prosecuted because they allegedly published false information, that those prosecutions are based on Decree 54 on cybercrime that was also adopted by the president without any process, and those decrees under the state of exceptions makes the reality that even after the adoption of the 2022 constitution, we are still Tunisia are still ruled under this framework that was supposed to be limited to the state of exception, supposed to be limited and temporary limited in its scope and temporary in its nature. In addition to those two frameworks, I think President Kais Saied is also taking advantage of the legacy of the past, of the legal framework that existed, the repressive laws and decrees that were adopted under President Bourguiba, President Ben Ali, and even after the revolution, and that limits enjoyment of human rights and allows the authorities, the security services or the government to crack down on human rights and the rule of law. Two concrete examples. The fact that the Office of Prosecutor right now is being politicized to target opponents, to target critics, that finds its root in the Tunisian law, the Code of Criminal Procedure, that makes the Office of the Prosecutor subordinated to the Minister of Justice and gives the Minister of Justice the right to issue instructions, direct instructions to prosecutors to initiate, including to initiate cases and investigations. So that subordination and that lack of independence of the prosecutor's office existed there before, and unfortunately was there. And unfortunately, after the revolution, nothing happened. Even though the constitution provided for such independence, nothing happened to ensure such independence in practice. Another example, and I will finish with that, is the decree on state of emergency. It's a decree of 1978. And based on that decree, the meetings of political parties of NADA, for example, are being suspended. And that decree can give the authorities wide powers to limit the right to freedom of assembly, limits the ability of political parties to meet, to convene, and to carry out their work, and also other entities, not only political parties. That decree can also be used to target the work of independent civil society organizations. So in sum, these are the major frameworks that allows the president to continue, and the authorities, Tunisian authorities, to continue their crackdown on the rule of law.
Many thanks, Said. I think that's a really... so Mayor, I'd like to bring you in here. So Said's explained there some of these laws of exception and the way that they've been used to target individuals. You in particular have written about the targeting of the political opposition in Tunisia, which of course includes your father, who is the leader of the Nahda party. Can you explain what's happening here? And what's the rationale behind the targeting of the political opposition? And if you could perhaps explain a little about to what extent you think this is a directed policy of the president versus a broader program developed by state officials.
Hello, thank you very much, Tim, and many thanks to Chatham House for this opportunity to discuss the situation in Tunisia. In answer to your question, Tim, Kais Saied is currently cracking down on all his dissidents, all those who oppose his coup, foremost, of course, my father, who is the elected leader of the dissolved parliament and leader of the largest political party in the country, another. Why is he doing that? Because he wants to establish an authoritarian regime where all power rests with himself, executive, legislative, and judicial, through the use of the police and the judiciary. Today, we have over 30 prominent dissidents in jail on politically motivated charges. Politicians, lawyers, civil society activists, journalists, trade unionists, and we have the feminist activist Shema Isa. The objective is to empty the political landscape of all parties and organizations because Saied simply does not believe in organized political parties and wants to establish a one-man rule, Gaddafi style. Saied excelled in exploiting crises and deepening tensions. He invested in the health crisis with the COVID epidemic, the financial crisis, and of course the political crisis with his incessant conflicts with parliament and the government he himself appointed, I might add. He used these crises as a justification for his power grab. He implemented his coup in stages. Initially, he started by freezing, then dissolving parliament using Article 80 of the Constitution to claim that his move is perfectly constitutional and legitimate, and then went on to scrap the Constitution altogether, writing his own, literally. He then dissolved all check and balanced institutions, notably the Supreme Judicial Council, again creating his own instead, and went about harassing judges in one single presidential decree, dismissing 57 of them in one go. After that, he set about engineering his own rather bizarre political system, a hyper-presidential, hyper-centralized system that revolves around himself. And this paved the ground for the current crackdown on the opposition, with not just arrests, but closing down of political headquarters of those of another, and the NSF, the National Salvation Front. You ask me, are these policies those of Kais Saied or state officials? Well, such a distinction no longer exists in Tunisia, really. Saied is currently the state. Of course, whether he is using the deep state or it is using him is another question. What is clear for the time being is that both are very happy to be using each other, united around one objective, which is restoring the old dictatorship. Kais Saied offered Tunisians a deal to get rid of parliament, the constitution, political parties, and in return, which he dismissed as being the root of all evils and the root of all misery, and get prosperity and wealth in return. And then what happened? He robbed Tunisians of their hard-won freedoms and gave them not only dictatorship, but poverty and bankruptcy instead. And I'd like to say a few words about Europe's. Currently, he's trying to get Europe's support by turning Tunisia into a massive detention center, an open-air prison for Tunisian and African migrants. And we might comment on the European delegation to Tunisia, led by Bologna recently. Do we have time for that?
We're going to come back to that. So I'd like to just park that there, if I may. This is clearly going to be a point of discussion, which we will certainly come back to shortly. But I wanted to just go back slightly to that point about bankruptcy and the parlous state of the Tunisian economy. So Tarek, if I could bring you in here. You wrote a paper recently that explores the current political situation and shines a light on the worsening socioeconomic conditions of Tunisians. Without wanting to sound too much like Tom Friedman, but on my many visits to Tunisia, where I usually end up talking about Libya, it was clear there were lots of complaints about skyrocketing food prices, complaints that people couldn't buy basic things like coffee in the shops. So I wonder if you could give us a bit of a background about what the source of these economic problems are, and then maybe connect that into the issue that Sumaya just raised about the increasing numbers of Tunisians seeking to leave Tunisian shores.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tim. All right, you've given me this challenge of trying to explain both Tunisia's economic crisis and the migration crisis in 5 minutes. So I'll give it a shot. Yeah, I think the best analogy I've heard for Tunisia's economy is that the economy and kind of a great chunk of its population too are trapped within what we're going to call this triangle of doom, which is a bit catastrophic, but bear with me on this. So on one edge, you have the international financial institutions, the IFIs, and the international creditors who are kind of strangling Tunisia's budget and are worsening their structural economic deficiencies. And on the other edge, you have the Tunisian oligarchs who are kind of strangling the private sector and worsening the Tunisian state's revenue generation. And then in the middle of these two, you have the political classes, stretching all the way back from Ben Ali to the Democratic Parliament to the mercurial Kais Saied. And these guys just play off of the two poles, and they use the arbitrage for personal profit and to buy social peace and to kind of keep the whole machine just ticking over. And as you kind of astutely pointed out, that machine is not ticking over. It's kind of just breaking down right now. And its breakdown is most visible in the food, the fuel, the medicine shortages, and also the price inflation that's kind of tearing through the country right now. And fundamentally, the problem is that growth has averaged at about 1.7% over the past decade, which is just not sufficient for Tunisia to be able to grow out of its debt obligations. And to make it worse, this growth is kind of classified as jobless growth. So it's not adding any extra jobs to the market, and it doesn't really have much broader benefits for the people in the economy. Now on the debts, firstly, Tunisia has been saddled with huge debts since the revolution of 2011. No sooner than had Ben Ali fled the country than Moody's downgraded Tunisia's credit rating, even though Moody's admitted in its own report that Tunisia's economic fundamentals were far healthier than the last time it was upgraded. So Tunisia kind of got punished by international agencies for having a democratic revolution. And then to cut a very long story short, Tunisia was forced to keep going back to debt markets to compensate for the structural flaws of Tunisia's economy, whereby it's dependent on importing, medicine, fuel, cereals, all these key goods, and these imports are made in foreign currencies. And then to make matters worse, the terrorist attacks at the Bordeaux Museum and so on killed tourism, which was a major source of foreign currencies. So the IMF stepped in, and a big part of the IMF's demands have been liberalization reforms with a particular focus on floating the currency, which has led to a huge devaluation of Tunisia's currency. Now, the economic orthodoxy says that this will help Tunisia because it will lower imports, which became too expensive, and it will raise exports, which will now become cheaper. But it doesn't really work like that in Tunisia's case because these things are both inelastic for Tunisia, meaning you can't just stop importing food or medicine because it's become more expensive. And then Tunisia's main export is agricultural goods to the EU, which are capped by quotas anyway, so you just get less in return for them. So really all the IMF has achieved so far is to balloon the value of Tunisia's debt and hurt the purchasing power of ordinary Tunisians. And then on the other side, you have the oligarch class, which kind of distilled after the revolution, as all of these companies that were owned by Ben Ali's extended family and were confiscated were snapped up by the rest of the oligarch class on the cheap, basically. So now these oligarchs control the economy. They have created huge barriers of entry to their main industries, ensuring that there's no competition. They influence or bully the politicians to ensure that they don't have to pay much tax. Regulations work in their favor. And a kind of great example of the parasitic nature of these class is from a World Bank report in 2017, which looked at only 114 individuals who are controlling key rents in Ben Ali's era. Now, they accounted for less than 1% of jobs. They accounted for 3% of all private sector output, and yet they collected 21% of all private sector profits in Tunis, which kind of gives you a great idea on the uselessness of these companies for the local economy, and yet the huge money which they are, or the capital which they are controlling. And because of them, the state cannot raise funds effectively, and the private sector cannot kind of provide the growth or the foreign currency that Tunis needs to grow out of its debt. So, and I'll kind of finish here, but for the average Tunisian who's in between these two, or who is stuck in the middle of this triangle of doom, he can't enter the private sector. He bears the brunt of a regressive tax regime. The state is not providing for them. And I think most Tunisians see the state as kind of being in league with those who are economically oppressing them. And Tunisians have made it clear since 2011 and in all kinds of consultation and polling that they believe very strongly in an economically interventionist state that prioritizes the idea of looking after the people. And they've called for it in as many ways as they can. They've done a revolution. They've voted in parliaments. They even backed Kais Saied, who is, the least politician in history, just because he was not of the system, and they believed that he would restore the system. And yet, despite all of this, they don't get anything in return. And whenever they protest about it, no matter which era it's in, they get beaten, they get abused, they get tortured. And it's this reality that has made Tunisians very nihilistic, and which is causing them to migrate, and which is why that migration will probably keep increasing as the crisis gets worse. Sorry, I went on a bit long, but I hope I answered both.
I think you did pretty well. It was quite a big question for 5 minutes, as you pointed out. I just mentioned here, I can see that people are starting to list questions in the Q&A. That's great. Just going to do one more round of questions, and then we'll get to some of the questions pitted by the audience. So please do keep them rolling in. Tarek, I want to stick with you now. I mean, in your recent paper, you made recommendations as to how the international community could provide assistance to Tunisia by building what you called a coalition of the concerned and providing support that would, quote, prepare the Tunisians for transition. Of course, implicit in that, or explicit in the paper, was that you believed it would be inevitable that the president would leave office, presumably sooner rather than later. Be interested to hear as to why you think that would be the case, but also to explain a little more about what your recommendations put forward in the paper.
Well, I'll mute myself. Thank you, Tim. And yeah, look, I understand that not everybody will agree with my conclusions. And I did say quite explicitly that I think that, this is not going to end well for President Saied. And it's not anything personal, but for me, the political maths just doesn't really work out for him. And I'll try to explain my working here so that you all can see whether you want to agree with me or not. But, President Saied is not the most complicated man. Everybody who's familiar with Tunis, they know him very well. He's shown his character and his capabilities very clearly during his time in power. And I kind of believe that he's doomed due to three overarching areas: his inadequacies as an administrator, his inadequacies as a politician, and the kind of tidal waves of crises that are coming for him. By trade, President Saied is not a politician, he's an academic. And by all accounts, he wasn't even a very good academic. And running a state, creating policy, implementing policy, these are all highly complex and challenging activities, which is why over 4 years as a president and 2 years as an absolute dictator, we've not actually seen him do any of these things. He forgoed the running of state to just focus on his pet project, this transitional program, for 1.5 years, where he drafted a new constitution. He oversaw the elections for his new political system. And, for him, this was his dream come true. By all accounts, President Saied fervently believed this project to be his destiny, this kind of messianic project for Tunisia to deliver what he believed to be the true course of the revolution. And despite all this, despite the fact that the guy is living out his dream, the entire program was, objectively speaking, it quickly saw him lose public belief and public interest. His public consultation, the constitutional referendum, the elections for a new parliament, all of these things had very little public participation. In fact, the parliamentary elections that were held in December drew the second lowest turnout in recorded history anywhere in the world for a national election. And even the process of drafting the constitution was kind of embarrassing for a constitutional law professor. He had to issue multiple post-publication edits. And despite all of this kind of lofty talk of direct democracy, the constitution was kind of just this very long-winded way to describe an absolute autocracy in the hands of the president. And even his friends and his former colleagues from the law school, who he had drafted in to consult and amend on his draft, were roundly ignored. And so the committee's chief, his old friend, publicly disassociated himself from the entire constitutional process, claiming that they were just used as a shill. And I'm going into detail on all of that because the experience is indicative of President Saied's personality and his political inadequacies, which is why he kind of struggles to ameliorate his administrative inadequacies. Now, quite strangely for a politician, Saied is not really a people person. And as I said, he believes himself to be on a messianic project, and he kind of very selfishly guards this project, which is why he's very diligent about concentrating all decision-making authority in his hands and allowing very little initiative in the rest of the system, to the extent that even the government, which he entirely appointed himself, are little more than kind of placeholders. They're not able to take decisions or to initiate policy. And so the result of all of this is that the Tunisian state has effectively atrophied over the past 2 years as all of these problems and crises pile up. And not only is President Saied jealous over his decision-making, but he's inflexible in his beliefs. He has zero tolerance for dissent of any kind, as my other co-panelists have said. And his personality is kind of one who is violently authoritarian, which means not only does he lose support and he's unable to build coalitions, as most politicians do, but he goes to war with other segments of the body politic. And this can be seen most plainly in how he kind of turned on the judiciary for refusing to follow his orders that were illegal by Tunisian law, and how he has gone from trying to build a coalition with the trade unions to then arresting and demonizing them, how he's shutting down the free media, and how he's turning his sights on civil society, a group that was kind of once hopefully expectant of him. So, my logic for all of this is to say that Saied is incapable of providing the solutions that Tunisians demand from him. But at the same time, he is incapable of recognizing his own shortcomings. And so is instead attacking the freedoms that Tunisians cherish as they question him and ask him to do more. So he's not only burning alliances, but he's systematically warring with the rest of the Tunisian state. And this is just not a sustainable political dynamic. I mean, even in the good times, it wouldn't be a sustainable dynamic, let alone in a moment like this when they're grappling with climate crises and economic crises and so on. Should I wrap up quickly or?
Yes, please.
Yeah. For me, the question was really what the end looks like. You could see a vicious cycle of protest and police repression that we're all familiar with. But I think given the immense nihilism of Tunisians, we'll probably see a lot more quieter transferal of power when it becomes clear that Tunisia is drowning in crises and he's just not capable of resolving them. And the big variable here, and the one we've not discussed so much, is the security services. So my whole point on the coalition of concerned was to say that there are a lot of countries that are vested in Tunisian stability, from neighbors like Algeria and Libya to the Europeans, and they should be forward thinking about this point and trying to plan for it to make sure that either Saied can be managed or that if he cannot salvage himself, then he doesn't take the rest of the country with him when he goes. Thanks. And sorry for dragging on a bit.
That's okay. Thank you. Very, very good to hear your analysis. I think there are some good questions as well, which will probe some of these points, which we'll come back to as well. Samaya, you were finishing on the point where you were looking at the kind of the politicking that's going on at the moment among foreign states and the Tunisian leadership. So I wondered if we could return to that question in a way and ask what role, if any, you believe the international community could play in pushing back against the targeting of the political opposition. And I wonder also if you could give your thoughts on what the domestic reaction is likely to be to that, particularly given that the president has sought to invoke claims of international conspiracy against Tunisians to ward off or to alleviate some of these potential pressures coming his way.
Yes. Well, when we talk about the international community, we don't, of course, talk about one homogeneous body or a single position, but multiple positions. And that's the case even within Europe, for instance. I mean, Europe, for Italy, for instance, with its far-right government, Tunisia equals migration, essentially. And the presence of a dictator unfettered by laws and democratic institutions suits it very well. I mean, it wants a coast guard to stop boats coming, essentially. And that is why Meloni has turned into Saied's leader, actively lobbying for him in the EU and the IMF. So what we have now, we seem to have an alliance between two populist fascisms on either side of the Mediterranean. The position of the French has been more ambiguous, and it largely reflects, I think, the difficulties France has been experiencing across Africa, really. It did no doubt support Kais Saied's coup, at least giving him the green light, but has found him very difficult to deal with, given his erratic, unpredictable nature and his obvious inability to manage the situation with even a minimum of reasonability. And they fear Tunisia turning into a new Mali. The American position, on the other hand, has been more consistent and the criticism more pronounced, given that the Americans have invested most in Tunisia's nascent democracy, which they had hoped could send a positive message after the mess the neocons had and Afghanistan, not to mention their fear that Saied might shift Tunisia's foreign policy towards Russia and China. So what should the international community do, you ask me? Well, for a start, it could begin by calling things by their proper names, calling a coup, regardless of how it tries to disguise its ugly face. I mean, the most vivid evidence of that has been the military vehicles barricading parliament for over 2 years. It should call for the immediate, unconditional release of all political prisoners and for an end to political trials and for the scandalous use of the judiciary as a weapon of political persecution. And of course, it should make any form of financial support conditional on at least initiation of restoring democracy in the country. The international community seems to be going back to the old, deeply flawed doctrine of stability, of doing business as usual with unsavory autocrats and dictators. But I mean, if the ill-fated Arab Spring taught us anything, it is that you can't have stability with dictatorship. What you have is just a veneer of stability sustained with much violence and much repression. It is a recipe for explosions, a recipe for chaos, for more despair, more migrants, and more terrorists. Only with democracy, with accountable governments, can you get genuine, lasting democracy. And it seems to me that Kais Saied is convinced that the international community does not have many options. All it can and will do is issue some statements of concerns, which he mocks, by the way, and then accept the status quo de facto, as a fait accompli. But what the West is effectively telling the region here and its people is that democracy is not for you, that might is right, force is the only way, and that, I think, is a very dangerous message to be sending indeed. I don't know if I have time to comment on the point about foreign intervention and the charge of treason, widely bandied about these days in Tunisia. I mean, I think most Tunisians realize that by now that these are just handy pretexts conveniently used by Saied to monopolize the situation and shut down any form of outside criticism. I mean, the proof of that is that he's only too happy to have Meloni's intervene in Tunisia's affair. But somehow then national sovereignty evaporates, it goes out of the window completely. But whenever, the international community is reminded of his human rights obligation, not by the international community, by maybe human rights organizations, then he, waves the flag of national sovereignty and cries traitors. I hope I haven't talked too much.
You haven't. Sumaya, thank you very much. Said, then coming back to you, Sumaya's talked about how obviously the international community is not one cohesive group, how different international players have engaged and continue to engage in Libya. But also mentioned that some countries, such as the US, had put support behind into Tunisia, seeing it as the success story, for want of a better phrase, of the Arab Spring. So moving forward then, what role, if any, do you think that international players could play in opposing the legal reforms that the president has pushed through, either by supporting domestic actors, civil society, and their pushback? And if the president's departure is likely to come, if not imminently, but at some point in the future, would such reforms become easier in the wake of Kais's removal? How much is this connected to him now as a person when looking to roll some of these things back?
Thanks, Tim. I think you would look at the frame, not just insisting on the framework, is if you continue with the same constitution of 2022, irrespective of who is going to be the president, you would have a system that lacks checks and balances, that lacks separation of power, that lacks judicial independence. So what the international community can do right now, I think, in terms of just the backsliding that is happening in the country, mitigating and trying to ensure that at least some basic safeguards can still exist. I don't think that there is any possibility for democracy and a democratic constitutional order to be reestablished in Tunisia without an independent media, without an independent judiciary, without a role for political parties that have been marginalized and have been excluded, without independent national institutions that were there before and that were dismantled altogether. And I don't think that you can consider even the possibility of a return to a constitutional democratic order without a significant role of civil society organizations and of other actors who can ensure that the lessons are being learned from the mistakes that happened in the past. And here, there was a question about stability and about the need, to deal with the situation as it is. When you look back, or at least, for those of us who have worked in the region during the early years of the Arab Spring, I don't think that the international community was at any doubt about how the people of the region and how Tunisian people, for example, were inspiring to everyone. And everyone was supporting the democratic process in Tunisia. International community supported the transitional justice process, supported the constitutional process. So for such support to evaporate somehow and to just focus on security considerations, on migration considerations, it would defeat, the very purpose of values-based engagement from the international community, and insisting on a vital role of such institutions, of civil society organizations, of judiciary or independent judiciary. If we are not focusing on those elements, I don't think that we'll be able to return back to an order in which the rule of law can be established.
Thank you very much. So let's now turn to some of the questions that have been coming in from our participants. There are a number, so I'm going to try and get through them. I think best to perhaps try and group them together a little bit. There's a question from Neil, another question from Waleed, which drew upon some similar dynamics. Neil points out, or questions perhaps, better way of putting it, the extent to which Kais enjoys popularity. There is a sentiment that the existing parties in Tunisia had become very unpopular. The parliament had become a source of ire for the population, and that, in a sense, his pushback against political parties was something that had a degree of social backing. I wanted to put that out to all three of you to see what your thoughts on this point are, to see where the Tunisian public's positioning stands in what has been a very long and winding transition since 2011, and with not necessarily direct material benefits, in the economic sphere and other ways to Tunisians that perhaps some may have hoped for. Who would like to start me off on that one? I'm happy to pick if nobody volunteers?
I don't mind answering I'll try and answer it briefly. I mean, look, I can't speak on behalf of Tunisians, but I think that the basis of the question was quite correct. There had been a lot of frustration with the political authorities. As I said in the response to the first question, there was a lot of frustration that the parliament and the governments had not been dealing with the economic problems that Tunisians wanted them to deal with. They had reneged on their promises to set up commissions to look into things like corruption. They were very overtly being influenced by the oligarch class. I mean, to the extent that Prime Minister Shahed actually went to the EU to ask them to take Ben Ali's son-in-law off of the EU sanctions list. So they felt like this might be a democratic parliament, but it doesn't represent them anymore. They represent the same old interest base. And then if you look at the kind of detailed polling that the Arab Barometer have done in Tunis, I think you can see the picture become a bit more clearer, whereby I think out of desperation, people supported Saied because they believed that he was going to break the existing system, to drain the swamp, to use Trump's language, and he was going to fix their economic problems. And they wanted somebody who could decisively fix problems for them. But at the same time, they're quite fond of their democratic freedoms, you know, the freedom of association and speech and so on. And so you can see like almost a wave of clarity that sweeps the Tunisians, and Said's popularity is dropping exponentially because people realize that actually he's making the economy worse. He's not fixing anything, and he's attacking us for trying to point things out and to work with him. So they seem to have lost on all accounts here.
Thanks. Said.
Just add in terms of popularity narrative, I think it's important to highlight that the key dates actually introduced by the president. There was a consultation process that the president initiated. It was supported by 5% of the population. The parliamentarian election participation was around 10%, and the constitution was adopted by around 28%. Those are figures that does not provide strong or democratic legitimacy. And I think if we are talking about the right of Tunisians, universally recognized right of Tunisians to take part in the conduct of public affairs and to participate in elections and to have representatives to elect their representative freely, the numbers that were there for all the major steps of the roadmap that took place in Tunisia over the 2 years, there were no popular support to it. So I would look at those numbers more than any other numbers, but I think that's also a matter of perspective.
Just one probe, Said. Walid Bashar asks, doesn't the Constitution of 2022 make legislators strongly accountable to their voters by forcing them to collect popular nominations and make them recallable by their base? I just wondered if you could respond to that point.
I would say, that as a system, I don't know whether it exists anywhere, but you ensure accountability of the legislative body through elections. There are other mechanisms of recalling members in cases of serious misconduct, etc. But I don't think that's what we've seen, or at least, the parliament, the way it was elected, the way the electoral law was drafted, the process how it has been handled, there are no indications, or at least there are no element to say that process was democratic, or that process resulted on reflecting the will of the majority of people. Because still, if we are not satisfied with a parliament that was elected by 45% or 50% democratic legitimacy, I struggle to see a parliament elected by 10% be more legitimate than another parliament, actually.
Understood. Samaya, I wonder if you want to come in on this topic of potential popularity of the platform of the president, and also connected. One of Neil's sub-questions was specifically about the hostility towards parties such as Ennahda, and clearly this is a remaining schism in among the Tunisian population. What would be your response to those points? I think you may be muted.
So sorry about that, that technical glitch. Right. I think there was a widespread belief that Kais Saied enjoys widespread popularity, huge popularity, but I think that turned out to be an illusion with the recent legislative elections, which were boycotted by around 90% of Tunisians. So we had elections without voters. Kais Saied saw Tunisians a lie, in fact, the propaganda machine, which was very hostile to the democratic nascent democracy, the democratic transition, sold this lie that parliament was the problem, democracy was the problem, and that if you substituted, if you gave away democracy, if you got rid of democracy and parliament, we would get prosperity and economic affluence. But that turned out to be a lie. Tunisians are realizing now that they lost these very hard-won freedoms and gained nothing. They have to queue up daily for basic supplies, and that's unprecedented in Tunisia's modern history, for sugar, bread, oil, the most basic needs. The propaganda machine spread the belief that Nahda had failed economically, that these governments that came after the revolution failed economically. And it would have been possible to accept that in 2022, for instance. But we saw what happened after in the last 2 years, 4 years, and 2 years with Saied having absolute power, with all power residing in his hand, he turned these economic difficulties. And now people are realizing that the counter-propaganda, the revolution counter-propaganda machine, what it has been describing as the Black Decade, has in fact been a bright decade where they enjoyed freedoms. No one was in jail for their opinions, for writing a Facebook post, as is the case today. And the economic situation was much better than it is today, even within, if we understand the context of the turbulent environment, regional environment Tunisia finds itself in, with a civil war on its borders, and the incessant daily strikes. I mean, recently, the head of the UGTT, which is the largest trade union in Tunisia, declared proudly that he said, and I quote, "We would not let them breathe." Talking about the governments, the post-revolution governments, we would not let them breathe. That we had daily strikes paralyzing the public sector, this affected the economy. We had a flight of investors, and of course, Morocco benefited a great deal from that. So even with all those conditions, the conditions of a transitional phase, a very delicate transitional phase, and a very sensitive regional environment, the economy was performed much better prior to the coup. And so Tunisians can see that they lost their freedoms and gained nothing.
Thank you very much. And thank you also for touching upon the UGTT, which was a question from another of the audience members. On this issue of the economy, Hetal asks, the issue of Tunisia, and by strangling the economy, placing pressure on the population, making them feel trapped, relating it to the issue of the lack of job opportunities for many Tunisian people. So what measures could be taken in the current context to address that problem? Open that up to the panel for any particular thoughts. Also, if anybody would wish to add on what they see the role of the unions and being within this process. Obviously, the role of unions has been very significant throughout the post-2011 period and before. Perhaps Tarek, could I pick on you in terms of the job creation question?
Sure. And yeah, job creation is a huge source of frustration for many Tunisians. I mean, I think it officially even sits in the high 30% right now. To try to break this down, perhaps I think that there are two major areas where you can try to create some jobs in the current system. The first is to improve what exists of the private sector, which needs a legislative approach to kind of break down some of the barriers to entry. And, you know, it's not just big industries that are controlled by the oligarchs. I mean, even things like date picking, road haulage, things like this are cornered by particular associations and so on. So trying to remove the barriers to entry to allow the private sector to start growing, I think is one quick way to try to boost things. And then, you know, I think that all of these countries around Tunisia who are very concerned right now about the Tunisian economy should be working on debt restructuring as much as they're working on looking for a cash injection. Because right now, if Tunisia gets to 1.9 billion or even a bit more from the IMF, that is all going to go into servicing loan repayments. What Tunisia really needs right now is economic investment in the country's infrastructure. So if you could do an investment drive in things like transportation infrastructure, tech and communications infrastructure, then not only do you kind of provide a source of labor, but you also grow the economy through that. Some other ideas that just popped up in the sense of in terms of tax collection as well. If you allow for municipalities to start collecting taxes on lower issues like corporation tax and so on, then you allow for less disparities between the regions, and so to try to help some of the regions outside of the capital grow. And even in the IMF plan to kind of cut down public sector spending and employment, perhaps a more targeted approach there is better. I mean, sure, there are some state-owned companies that are hugely overburdened because they're just employing for the sake of employing, but areas like healthcare and medicine, like healthcare and education, this is an area where you have a good potential workforce. In fact, Tunisia's young doctors and nurses are filling up the French health sector right now. But because of a blanket ban on hiring, it means that these areas that are in need cannot hire. So yeah, those four areas I think could be a good way to start growing the job market.
Just while we're on the point, I want to connect this to Dimitri's question about the IFIs. You've mentioned the IMF there. There's a lot of discussion about what the IMF is or isn't going to do with relation to Tunisia. There's also been a lot of criticism across the region in the past where IMF policies have caused significant pain to civilian populations. Is the what could or what should the approach of the IFIs be towards supporting some of the outcomes that you mentioned? Is that in line with what they're looking at the moment? Are there things that can be done?
I mean, these are all things that could be done and things that all could be supported by an IMF program. But unfortunately, right now, the IMF program, so their perspective is to try to grow the Tunisian economy to be able to service its debt. So to provide it with the foreign currency, it needs to keep imports going, but also to make these debt repayments, because about 60% of Tunisia's debt is external. But I think that their ideological hang-ups on kind of market liberalism are distracting them from solving the actual problems of Tunisia's economy. So they look too much at things like liberalization and liberalizing the economy, which has the effect I explained before, which just makes the debt more expensive. Instead, they should be looking at the actual reasons in the context before them. So things like removing subsidies and cutting the public sector payroll. I mean, these are all well and good at cutting down public sector spending, but they cause tremendous harm, and they actually put the pain of economic recovery on the least able to bear it. Whereas if they instead focused on reforming the tax collection system, or in removing barriers to entry to the private sector, improving the regulatory environment, then you could actually allow the economy to grow and grow out of debt, instead of trying to do this austerity first approach of trying to cut spending and therefore enable more of the Tunisian state's resources to be able to service debt. I mean, by the IMF's own internal reporting or their analysis, they see political issues and political actors as being one of the primary functions of whether their programs get implemented or not. So they should follow their own reporting, and to move away from less politically divisive kind of policies towards ones where you could actually get the population on board. You could actually get coalitions on board to start driving these reforms through. Yeah, I hope that answers it.
Yeah.
Tim, if
Samaya, please.
I may come in. I mean, I think Tunisians have had their fair share of economic proposals. And of course, you know, these you can't avoid, if you wanted to solve the country's enormous economic problems, you have to start by reforming the state sector. Of course, you know, you need to reduce the wage mass. You need to direct subsidies to those who deserve them and need them most. And you need to create an atmosphere conducive to investment. But you can't do this without building national consensus through dialogue. And compromise and consensus and dialogue are the biggest sins in Kais Saied's handbook. And that's why even when you talk about economics, the economy, you can talk about all sorts of details and proposals, but you can't avoid politics. Tunisia's problems are political. You can't, in order to resolve its enormous economic problems, you need to have national consensus. And without someone prepared to compromise and open dialogue with different economic players, with different national players, civil society and political parties, you can't have that consensus. And that's why you cannot talk about economics without talking about politics. Even if we talk about immigration, you know, the main problem in Tunisia today, it affects everyone, you know, the young, not just the young. I mean, today, even professionals want to leave, even businessmen want to leave. It's because we're experiencing a death of hope in Tunisia, you know, widespread climates of despair and disillusionment. You know, the two words most heard in Tunisia are lhajja and tarqa, which mean leaving, even illegally. So it's not just the marginalized, angry sectors of society today which are seeking to leave, but even, as I said, these new sectors, doctors, teachers, businessmen. Why is that? Because everything around them is in crisis. And that goes down to politics, essentially. I think the remedy for the prevalent climate, for this very complex crisis, isn't, for Europe, for instance, isn't to turn the country into a huge open-air detention center, guarded by our new bad boy, Kais Saied, for, in return, you know, for a measly 100 million euros and some equipment to patrol the coasts. What you need is a comprehensive approach. And try as you may, you cannot avoid politics. Everything goes through politics. As long as we have a president whose chief concern is to fuel tension, spread hatred and division, while accumulating power and locking up critics, you will not advance by an inch. And you know, as I said, God knows Tunisia has had its fair share of economic proposals. What it really needs is the political will to implement these programs and a national consensus around it. But consensus and Kais Saied don't go together, unfortunately. So he is very much part of the problem.
Consensus also very difficult to reach, of course. I was struck earlier by Tariq's point that Kais is an academic by training and not necessarily, you know, best at implementing even his own ideas. I think as someone who's a big fan of academics and who is trying to do a PhD, I wouldn't necessarily put them in charge of many things, it's fair to say. But there's been a lot of talk in this discussion about authoritarianism, which has been borne out by the points that each of you have made. Said, bringing you back in. So Claudia asks, is there effectively a process of authoritarian learning that's been going on here in Tunisia? Has Kais's regime taken on board lessons from other contexts, perhaps? And I want to also add a specific question that came through from Mohammed, where he drew upon some of your comments in your earlier response, where you noted that Kais had actually been utilizing laws on the statute from previous eras under Ben Ali and Bourguiba. He asks a simple question in that sense: why, when there was the opportunity to cancel such legislation in the post-2000 period, did that not happen?
Sure. So let's start with the first question. I think on 25th of July, President Saied declared himself the head of the office of the prosecutor. The patterns related to consolidation of authoritarianism is that for such authoritarianism to succeed, or for such power grab to succeed, you would have to control the judiciary, you would have to control the office of the prosecutor. To have a judicial system being used as a tool of repression is something that we documented in other countries, in other contexts. That's exactly what the judiciary in Egypt is doing. That's exactly what happened in other contexts, including in Europe. So controlling the judiciary, that's a pattern that you would see in similar processes in the MENA region and in other contexts. The same thing for limiting the space for civil society organization. There was one of the questions about the draft decree on civil society organization, and to what extent it limits, even though it's not been adopted yet, it limits the ability of civil society organization to act independently in terms of their registration, in terms of their access to funding and ability to act or operate independently in the country. And that pattern you would find also in other contexts in the MENA region. So look what's happening with civil society organization in Egypt. If you look at what's happening in civil society organization in other countries in the region, Algeria or others, those are patterns that you would find not only in the region, also in Europe and other contexts as well. But I think here the learning processes or how such processes develop, I think. Yes, definitely you can say that these patterns exist, and that if I give just concrete example, the abusive use of counterterrorism measures, the abusive use of exceptional measures or emergency decrees. If you look at what's happened in the region and even beyond the region, there was something that governments usually try to use those mechanisms to crack down on rule of law, on human rights, and on free speech. Second question about why other governments did not cancel or revoke the problematic laws and the problematic decrees that existed before. I think short answer is Tunisia's democracy survived for 10 years. So you can argue 10 years, it's a long period of time to establish a perfect system adhering to all rule of law principles, etc. Or you can also say that during these 10 years, Tunisia achieved a lot as well, and that there was a process of transitional justice. There was a process by the Truth Commission, by the specialized chambers. There were elections, transfer of power based on the free will of the people. So I would struggle to say, of course, there was a failure from government to look at decrees from 78, but maybe they didn't even realize that those decrees were still into force. Or maybe they didn't realize that with the safeguards that were in the 2014 constitution, the independence of the parquet, if it was provided for in the constitution, that's fine. So there is no need, or there was no emergency to amend the law. But now we are seeing that it was really important, and many governments and many authorities actually, in Tunisia over the past 10 years missed on those opportunities. And we are seeing the government now using frameworks that I would say even after the revolution, the counterterrorism law that is now being used to charge people, including judges and prosecutors, for us, in terms of just documenting the cases of judges and prosecutors who were dismissed by the presidents, they were not only dismissed, they were dismissed and they've been subject to criminal prosecutions. And when you look at the accusations against them, is establishing and joining terrorist organization, is conspiring against the state, accusations that came with the 2015 law on counterterrorism that was a result of the democratic process, if I may. So yeah, I would say in one hand, Tunisia over the past 10 years before the power grab did significant steps to establish the rule of law. Was that enough? Of course not. And because it wasn't enough, we are where we are right now. I think there was also one, sorry if I'm, I can, no, there was one question about what should have been done differently to not reach the outcome that we reached right now. And I think here, you look at the reform of security services. This was, the uprising was against abuses committed by security services. For 10 years, there were no effective processes to ensure the subordination of these services to legally constituted civilian authorities, or to ensure their accountability for past abuses, or to ensure vetting processes. Of course, many of them, or many of states of security officials were prosecuted before the transitional justice mechanism. But one area of reform, security reform, wasn't there. It wasn't implemented. In terms of even the electoral process and how it has been handled, and how the electoral system contributed to the dissatisfaction that the other panelists were talking about. The idea of having an electoral system based on proportionality, resulting in fragmented political scene, and resulting in governments that were not coherent. And as a result, because of the fighting that was taking place, we did not establish, or the Tunisian authorities were not able to establish a constitutional court. After the power grab, 25th of July, everyone was asking why we don't have why wasn't there a constitutional court that could have acted as a check on the president in terms of his declaration of the state of exception.
And in 30 seconds, Said, Roberta asks, is a revision of the National Association law forthcoming? Is that something that you're expecting or looking at, just very briefly?
We are keeping close eye on it, as the draft has been leaked or circulated for more than a year right now, but some of the worrying tendencies there are some social media campaigns about the funding of civil society organizations. There is a narrative that is already being developed about these organizations being foreign agents and serving foreign interests. Whether that is an indication that that decree is going to be adopted anytime soon, that's not clear yet, but the scene is already set in terms of already using information that these organizations were providing to the government about their sources of funding to delegitimize them and to undermine their role.
Understood. Well, we're coming to the end now. So for the last 5 minutes or so, I want to give the panelists a chance to just summarize any points that they would like to reiterate, or anything that they haven't brought up. I apologize to those in the audience who have submitted questions and we haven't got round to them. We've covered as many as we can. There are some outstanding issues within there which the panelists may wish to address on what civil society can do in the current circumstances, over the ability of Kais to move on the economic file, even if he wished, given the strength of existing oligarchs, and also questions over the leverage that international players may have over Tunisia or with Tunisia. But I'll pass now to Sumaya. If I could just ask you within a couple of minutes to make any closing remarks you'd like to make and any key points you'd like to reiterate.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like to say a few words about the European delegation to Tunisia, the recent European delegation to Tunisia. It was led by Giorgia Meloni, of course, the head of the Italian government, the far-right Italian government. And it seems to me that Europe appears to be happily entering under the umbrella of the rather racist far-right, seeing Tunisia solely through the prism of migration. And it's as though it did not have a people suffering from dictatorship, no oppression, no political prisoners, and as though Tunisians had no right to freedom and no right to dignity like other nations of the world. And I think that is truly shameful. I think that is the height of hypocrisy from a continent Europe and a body, the EU, that incessantly talks about our values, values to which it seems those on the other side of the Mediterranean have no right. Yes. I might add a point about authoritarianism. There was a question about authoritarianism. Yes, we are seeing a rise in the authoritarian camp, in despotisms. Recently, there was the Arab Summit, and President Saied was widely celebrated by Bashar al-Assad. Tunisia is back. So, this camp is currently on the rise. And which has prompted many people to ask if the Arab Spring is dead. And I think we could have accepted such a view had those who had overthrown the Arab revolutions brought about a better alternative. But what we see in Tunisia, and we have seen in Egypt, is not the case. They seem to have made matters worse. There was a claim that the Arab Spring is an American conspiracy and that it's at the root of all the region's ills, and that's nonsense in my opinion. It was an answer to real problems, and the factors underlying the Arab revolutions are still very much there, and in my view, that makes future imminent eruptions very likely indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Tariq, if I may pass to you.
Yeah, thank you. As a think tanker, I'll try and do the policy recommendations bit. But I thank Sumaya as well for dealing with the recent Team Europe trip to Tunis, because she did it in a far more sophisticated and eloquent way than I would have mustered up. I mean, when I saw the tweet from von der Leyen about her press point where no press was allowed, I wasn't sure if it was real for a minute or if we were just looking at a teaser trailer for a terrible sequel to Team America. But look, you raised the point of leverage, and the reason why I commented again on that is because Team Europe comes to Tunis and they believe, you know what, we can have leverage over Kais Saied because we can offer him money, which allows him to avoid default, and we can offer protections and protecting the privileges of the security services. Therefore, we get what we want, which is to stop migrants, and he gets what he wants. But the thing that they don't seem to realize about President Saied is that the guy is immune to leverage because he does not operate like a normal politician. He will happily take and pocket whatever you would like to give him, but the second you try to use leverage on him, he will turn on you. And he is quite adept at playing to the street in terms of the interventionist Europeans. And I mean, even less than a day after he met with Meloni and von der Leyen and so on, he was telling his local press agency that he will not allow Tunis to become a detention center. So they are really kind of chasing a red herring here. I mean, you have two fundamental issues that are going to cause crisis for Tunis and Europe and are going to drive migration. And this is the economy and the growing authoritarianism of Kais Saied. And there are ways that Europe can help to deal with both. I mean, with all of the very good points that Sumaya raised on the importance of politics and economics, Tunisia desperately needs foreign cash injection to avoid a bailout. I don't think that Saied really knows much or understands much about the current IMF deal on the table. He just knows that it's unpopular. He doesn't like the idea of the IMF anyway. It goes against his ideology, and so he's happy to reject it. But if we can use this opportunity to kind of change that IMF deal to make it more focused on these structural problems that the people have long called for, then suddenly that deal becomes a bit more populist, and it gives President Saied the optics he needs to accept it and look like a good guy. Now, that might provide him a temporary boost, but it stops Tunisia's economy from going off a cliff edge. And Saied's politics and administration and such, like I described before, means that he is going to run into a brick wall eventually anyway. And on the other side is Saied's authoritarianism. Look, he relies on his security services. They are the ones who are implementing everything for him. He has no base, he has no faction of his own. Europe and the United States should be using their leverage over these security services to get them to follow or to uphold the rule of law, and to put pressure on them and show them that they cannot operate with impunity, to try to use the leverage of them being a major non-NATO ally and all these privileges that they enjoy from the Europeans. Instead, they are doing the opposite. They are handing all of their power over to him to say, essentially, please just stop the migrants from coming. So these are two self-defeating policies that are driving migration and are creating a growing crisis, whereas they should be doing the opposite. That was just my point. Thank you.
Forgive me for jumping in. I'm conscious of time. So I just want to give you also a minute or so just to add anything further to the points that you've made already.
Yes, to highlight, I think for Tunisia was the exception in so many ways in terms of having a constitution that was adopted by a democratically constituted assembly, having a parliament, free transfer of power. I think what we are missing here in terms of the approach to considering this just through the prism of security, migration, stability, we are bringing, or we are just facilitating the non-emergence of a return to a constitutional democratic order. International community must insist on those who are arrested to be released, civil society organization able, judiciary able to act independently, civil society organizations are able to act independently, and for media pluralism, political pluralism. And I think it's really important for that message to be consistent. Accepting the status quo as it is will unfortunately not lead to a reemergence of democracy. And we have witnessed this before. And it seems sometimes that we are keeping repeating the same mistakes in terms of approaching this situation and in terms of using the same paradigms. I hope that that there are enough consideration to ensuring that what's happened, just the ability of the international community to push forward, to press for return to a constitutional order that is based on democracy and the rule of law.
Said, thank you very much. Thank you also to Tariq and Sumaya, and for everybody who's joined the conversation. Thank you for your questions. And again, apologies to those we didn't get to. I'm not going to begin to attempt to sum up all of the points that were just made, but I think there were some very clear points on each level there in terms of political participation, on economic reform, on the importance of the rule of law and the processes that have been underway. I'll just finish by mentioning that our next Chatham House webinar will be a hybrid event in person and online, which will look at Libya since 2011, bringing together the participants who have written in a new edited volume. I'll congratulate myself slightly for only mentioning Libya once in the whole webinar, but unfortunately I did that in the first 1 minute, so maybe I shouldn't be too self-congratulatory. But once again, thank you, and we hope to see you at the next event, and thank you once again to all of our panelists.